we'll go ahead and get started. My dog submitted this Tuesday's tidbit, and she's quite proud of her success rate so far. There is a analytics workshop coming up in February that Joe Franz, one of our advisors, is chairing. So please check out the website for this and submit or register if you're interested. And as a brief overview of ResFrac, our objective always is to maximize economic returns for operators. And we do so by changing cluster and stage spacing, limited entry, landing zone, well spacing, IOR, EOR strategies, refracking, etc., in a digital or virtual environment to save money and do those iterations in a zero cost or very low cost virtual environment before actually putting a bit in the ground and trying in the field. The key to doing so is being able to simulate the entire life cycle of a well in a single model. And so ResFrac models that entire process from fracturing through leakoff, closure, production, and any subsequent actions like refracking or an offsetting well being drilled or EOR. And as a fully physics-based simulator, it's applicable to a broad range of assets, although most of what we'll talk about today, as well as most of the work that we do, is focused on unconventional shales. So the three components of that life cycle are the fracture propagation, reservoir flow, and geomechanics. And so to mix things up, I included a new example here. So it's going to be a 5-well parent-child simulation where we have 2 parent wells that are going to be fracked at the same time, produce for several years, and then we will frack the subsequent 3 wells and be able to see the decrement there on production from the child wells. So here come the infill 3 wells, and we deplete. And you can see that the parent wells get a slight boost from the shut-in and repressurization, but then the child wells actually don't perform at the same magnitude as the parent wells. So they aren't interacting with that drainage region. We have ways to control how much damage may occur in that parent well, which Mark talked about in the subsequent or preceding office hours, and it's all fully tunable within ResFrac. So we both license the software as well as consult for clients. If you're interested in either, you can ask me afterwards, but today we'll focus on the technical aspects, drawing upon our experience that spans the Americas at this point. So today's topic is on interpreting simulations. And this is something that I am continuing to bake. So I'm not going to present this as something that's fully baked, but rather gathering some thoughts as I was recently asked for suggestions on how to present results, what to look at in simulations, how to explain a simulation result. And so a little bit of a wordy slide, but the way I think about simulation results is by telling a story. And so the first step is to figure out what that story is and figure out what the ending of the story is. And you may not always have the ending, and then it's a different presentation, but for one where you want to draw a conclusion, that conclusion is the end of your story. And in formulating the story, it's similar to history matching in that you form a hypothesis and then you can test that hypothesis by looking at various diagnostics within a simulation. So for instance, the example I give here below is that, case 1 is outperforming case 2. You can see that very quickly and very early when looking at 2 simulation results. But then the next step is to form a hypothesis about why case 1 outperforms case 2. And then you can test that. So you might think it's a difference in fracture area, And so then you would go in and there's ways to plot fracture area and look at how that area is created in a simulation. And if that ends up holding true, then it strengthens your hypothesis and you would continue down that road. If it doesn't, then you need to form a new hypothesis for why one case is outperforming another. So the key to that step is really figuring out what the end of your story is so that you can have a directed presentation when relaying those results. In other words, a presentation should not be a murder mystery, but instead start with the main conclusion and the explanation, then go into threading that needle through the various pieces of evidence for why you believe that conclusion to be true. And the nice thing about physical models is that they're cause and effect systems. So in a simulation, we should always be able to dissect and explain why we are getting a result. So as the example that I started with, if we have case X is outperforming case Y, that is your conclusion. And so maybe it's a design decision you are supporting that case X or decision X is better than decision Y. And then you support that conclusion by coming up with successively more detailed whys. And so one of the things that I like to say is you should always be able to answer why one more time than you are being asked. So case X outperforms case Y because case X creates more fracture area than case Y. I should not have used the letter Y because I'm going to say that a lot now. And so then the next logical follow-up is, why does case Y create more fracture area than case X? So answer one more why. Fewer fractures initiate in case Y because there is more stress shadow. And yes, you can visualize stress shadow and show how that's occurring in a ResFrac simulation. So why does more stress shadow and lower perforation efficiency in case Y yield less fracture area? Well, because of the nonlinearity of gravitational effects and other processes, propped area and the number of perforations are not interchangeable. So when you reduce the number of perforations by half, or the number of fractures by half, your fract or your propped lengths do not double, right? And so you can show that in a simulation and then show a video of proppant settling. So in providing a little bit of a framework or hints as to where to look for this evidence and how to present it, I separate ResFrac simulations into two phases. You have both fracturing and production. And then during each of those processes, I try to think of what are the key diagnostics or key visualizations and metrics that I look at that could possibly differentiate one simulation from another. And so during fracturing, I look at fracture initiation, perforation efficiency, which is often a function of stress shadowing. I also look at leakoff. Are fractures fully closed? If I'm looking at two different scenarios and there's a difference, that could be one difference. And then during production, I really think about what are the dominant factors or variables that go into production. And to me, there's really three. It's fracture area, which predominantly is propped area when I'm thinking about production, the permeability that is being accessed, and the pressure that we are depleting. And so we can look at each of those as we dissect a simulation. So for fracture initiation, what I like to do is I plot the image in the 3D viewer. I look at a property, and then under the toggles, I turn on clusters, and I look for any uninitiated clusters. But then secondly, there's a second component to fracture initiation, which is this concept of what's an effective fracture. And so I don't have an example here, but there are cases where you will form a fracture, but you don't get any proppant. So you can see that in this image, I looked at proppant total mass, and that allows me to see which of my fractures actually have proppant in them. And there can be cases where you initiate a fracture but have no proppant, and then it's unlikely that that's going to be an effective fracture. And so I may not count that when looking at something or reporting something like fracture or perforation efficiency. Secondly, on stress shadowing and looking at if one simulation has more stress shadow than another, there are two things I would typically look at. One is we can plot stress shadow at any particular horizon in a model. We do have to define that horizon ahead of time. So I typically define at least one at the same elevation as my wellbore. And then you can actually make a video and see how that stress shadow evolves through time. So that's the first stage, and here's the second stage. And I could pause at certain points and compare if one stage versus another exhibited higher stress shadow. And here we see that there's some degree of locked-in stress shadow as the aperture of these fractures never fully returns to zero. And then the second metric I use to assess kind of stress shadow, and not a perfect metric, but one to look at, is escalation in ISOP. It is a rough approximation of whether or not one simulation or one condition is exhibiting more stress shadowing than another. So if I saw more build from stage to stage, then I might conclude that there is more stress shadowing in that simulation than another. And then we'd look at the implications thereof. And then finally, in the realm of fracturing, the last thing I like to look at is leak-off. And where is leak-off occurring? And predominantly, are my fractures closed prior to production? And so there's a very useful property in the 3D viewer called E-open. And E-open is the aperture that is not mechanically closed. So a mechanically closed aperture could be non-zero because you're closed on top of proppant. And so it's feasible that you could have like a ½ inch aperture in a fracture somewhere if you just had a bunch of proppant that was wedged, and it could still be a closed fracture. And so that's why we tend to look at E-open instead of total aperture when we're trying to figure out whether or not a fracture is closed. So in this image that I took on the left-hand side, this is a screenshot just after the last stage of this model was fracked, or maybe several hours after. And so you can see that the fractures in this first stage are almost entirely closed, right? E-open is almost at zero, which is that dark navy blue. And then as we progress into further stages along the model, those fractures are still leaking off. And so there is open fracture area, as indicated by the green, and now the orange and the red, in portions of those fractures. And if that were the case, and I turned this well onto production at this point, I would expect flush water production from these fractures, as basically you get this squeeze effect of squeezing the ketchup bottle, and you'd get all this water pushed and squirting back up to surface. We can also visualize leak-off in the 3D viewer. This may have implications on like relative permeability. So I look at where my water has leaked off and whether or not it's shifting me on that rel perm curve in a meaningful manner as to where I start with the relative permeability of my dominant phase, whether that's gas or oil. And then you can actually explicitly plot where leak-off is happening in the fractures. So you can plot the water leak-off per area and actually get a heat map where the hotter colors here are where more leak-off is occurring in the fractures. And during production, there are other metrics that I continue to like. So similar to the Leakoff heat map, you can create the same for production, which I'm showing here in the lower right. So you can choose a phase. In this case, I chose gas. And you can plot where that gas is coming from. This is particularly helpful for identifying if you have pay and non-pay, and ensuring that your productive phase, either oil or gas, is coming from where you want it to come from, or where it's supposed to come from, but could also identify differences, right? So there was an example of a simulation where I was trying to figure out why one well was doing so much better than another well. And it was because the bottom tip of the fractures in one well had actually touched down into a higher saturation zone and were super productive. And so when I looked at this color heat map, it became very apparent where I had kind of yellow and green for most of the fracture area, then this bright red along just the bottom elements of the fracture. And now clearly that's likely not realistic in that case. And so that gave me clues onto where I needed to change my model. But prior to going to the productive phase itself, we can also look at propped area. So propped area is predominantly where our production is going to come from. So on the upper left, I've plotted that proppant total mass per area. And you can look at kind of the lengths of fractures, whether or not fractures are connecting between wells, or the propped areas are going to connect between wells, and whether you would expect communication from well to well, as well as comparing height or length from simulation to simulation. Often, I treat my line plots as my initial diagnostic, and then use the 3D image to explain why. So I've keyed up a couple simulations. One thing that we can look at is we can actually plot the productive area or the propped area for various simulations. And so I could load two different simulations into the Viz tool and then very quickly compare the total propped area between simulations or the total productive area. And so you may ask, what is total productive area? Well, you can see it actually grows through time. And so that is the portion of the fractures that actually contribute production that gets into the wellbore. And so as that pressure gradient extends farther and farther into the fracture through time, you do expect a slight increase in your productive area. Permeability. It's more than just your initial permeability. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing initial permeability. And we can see we have a pay zone, kind of streaky stuff, and then another pay zone. But the permeability we're interested in is the effective permeability, right? Because as we saw during Leakoff, the saturation change in the matrix can change that relative permeability and may substantially shift the effective permeability to your productive phase. And so you can also plot the relative permeability of a phase. So on the right-hand side, I've plotted the gas relative permeability. And we can see that around this fracture, because of that water leak-off, we have shifted the relative permeability down substantially from about 0.3 to 0.2 in the green. And so had that occurred in all my fractures, that may also give me a diagnostic or a differentiator between simulations. And then finally, pressure. Pressure may be the single most important attribute that I look at when comparing simulations, because it tells me so many things. It can tell me whether the fracture is infinite conductivity or not, tells me the drainage region or drainage extent of each of my fractures, as well as if I look and kind of average it across the well. And if I combine that with an Rta plot, I can often see pressure interference that is occurring. And so on the right-hand side, I've included an example from our training material where we have the RTA plot for 3 different simulations plotted. And the theory of RTA plots is that this trend will be linear until a no flow boundary or a boundary dominated effect is felt. And so in these 3 simulations of equivalent lateral length, we have put various numbers of fractures while keeping total fracture area the same. And as such, the initial slope of all 3 is identical at the very beginning of the simulation. But what happens is in the 10 fracture case, where the fractures are much closer together, we see interference much earlier, and so you see a deviation from linear flow earlier than in the 6 or the 4 fracture case. Oh, and I had an example of that. So here is just a generic simulation I ran. We can see at about 3 years, there is drainage along each of the fractures in the well, but it's mainly green, so probably in that 1200 PSI range in between fractures. And then keeping the same pump schedule, I pumped the same exact job, but with double the number of perforations. And now we see dark blue because the extent of the fractures is smaller. Each of the fractures is shorter because mass is conserved. And they are closer together, and so I'm getting pressure interference. And this is actually at 2.6 hours, so even earlier in time. And if I were to compare the RTA plots, I would see that steeper slope in that simulation. So we can do that. Here, where the purple is the tighter cluster spacing and orange is the sparser cluster spacing. And indeed, that theory holds true even when we're at kind of a field scale simulation. So, like I said, this was designed to just give some ideas on places to start looking when comparing simulations and presenting results. Still need to formulate into a recipe like our history matching process, but hopefully gives you some guidance. Happy to take questions. What I also did in preparation is I ran 3 simulations, a base case, and then I moved the wells with 2 wells. Then I moved the wells very close together, and then I had the wells with original spacing, but tightened the cluster spacing. And so if anyone wants to posit a theory for the performance differences between the simulation cases, we could test that together, or any other questions that folks have. So many questions all at once.
Real quick, go over our 3 simulations that you did there. You got regular cluster spacing, tighter, and then less.
Yeah, let me pull up a third image here. So this is my base case simulation. I just did 1 stage in 2 wells. It runs very, very quickly, which was the intent. I can turn on perforations, and we can see that we have 6 perforations per stage in the 2 wells. And I think these were spaced something at like 1,200 feet apart. So then I ran a second simulation where I took those same wells, but now I put them 500 feet apart. And so they're much closer. You can see they're interacting much more than they were previously. And then in the third simulation, I returned to that original well spacing at 1,200 feet, but then I increased the number of clusters by 2 times, or doubled the number of clusters while keeping the same injection schedule. So just a very basic comparison of well spacing and then a basic comparison of cluster spacing. So before I turn on the legend, and I'm plotting the production of each of the wells, or for the left-hand well in each of the three cases here. Any votes on who thinks the highest production, medium production, and lowest production between those three cases is? Kind of already gave away a little bit of the answer. There is a chat going on here. Yes, raw results, I think we showed a couple times, but there are some very useful files in there. So if you go from the menu and open the simulation file in Folder Explorer, it brings you to the underlying folder structure where all the results sit. You can go into the results folder and then into raw results, and there's a host of files that are produced. My go-to is this Frac versus depth. And so if I open up this file, and apparently everything always opens on my other monitor. One of the very useful things that it produces is versus depth, a series of properties. Oh, that's just way too much. So we can see that there is total propped area per thickness, which is going to be one of the things that I will plot and compare between simulations. So I can very quickly make a plot, and of course this is turned 90 degrees. So this is going up toward the surface as we move along the left, or move to the left along the x-axis. And we can see where the dominant fracture area is being created. And make that a line plot to make that a little bit more clear. And so what I can do is I can plot this versus other simulations. So for instance, there was a simulation where that is the tight cluster spacing. So if I come back and I open up my original simulation, one effect of moving clusters closer together is that there is more stress shadowing. With more stress shadowing, occasionally you would expect to see more frac height. And so one of the things I can do here is I could compare whether or not indeed I'm getting more frac height when I place clusters closer together. And conveniently, the first column here is going to be the same if I have the same mesh defined for my simulations. So we can see that they have slightly different shapes, not tremendously, but if I were doing a series of sensitivities, this is one of the things I might look at and try to explain. Okay, in the orange case here, it does look like I generate a little bit more fracture area, and then maybe this is fatter down below. Another way to compare that would be to come back into the Viz tool. And I believe this is the case where I've loaded all the simulations. So if I scroll down, there is a total propped area. So propped fracture surface area. And we can give these some different names. So again, the three cases I had were my base case, and then tight cluster spacing. And tight well spacing. So you can see there actually is a difference in total propped area. So even though I'm pumping the same amount of proppant in all three cases, there is a difference because that proppant doesn't just get to travel infinitely, but instead is settling because of gravity, is getting held up on fracture roughness, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the case where you have the least propped fracture area, you may have actually thicker proppant or higher conductivity because more of it has been kind of smashed into the same fracture area. But then look, between comparing that as well as using the raw results, you can see where that difference in fracture area may be occurring. So in this case, it looks like we're getting longer fractures in that 6,900 depth in the tight cluster spacing. So probably not longer fractures, but we have more fractures located at that 6,900 foot depth. So here's that base case, the well spacing, here's the tight cluster spacing. I come back and turn on my ruler. So 6,900 looks like almost exactly the depth that my well is landed at. And then I can stretch this back out again. And that kind of makes sense that I'd have more propped area because I'm just getting a little bit of proppant in each of those fractures. And so when we add that up, that's going to be higher than when we separate that between half the number of fractures. There's the propped regions. Come back to the base case. And so one thing I've done is I've turned on the fracture element edges, which you can do under the toggles. But one thing that allows you to do is you can count elements quickly, and then you know the length of your elements. And so it is a good way to just roughly look at length of things in a simulation, namely fractures. So I'd say on average, these are probably about 4 elements long, and I have 6 of them. Versus in this case, maybe my average in terms of the propped region is 2.5 to 3 elements, right? But I have double the number. And so then that is why I'm getting the greater propped area at that depth in the tight cluster spacing. You can also then compare things like the productive area. I have to expand these to see which is. Okay, so here's gas production. And if I come back to my other file and grab gas production, I'm gonna have to color that. We can also compare where production is coming from between the two simulations as well. So that's why I like that Frac for steps file, is it really does help you identify where to look, but then I always go back to the 3D viewer to make those images and confirm that we can actually visualize that, and a 3D image in a presentation always looks much nicer, particularly if paired with one of these charts. Any other questions from the Hive? Dave, you're getting some compliments for last week's presentation if you look at the comments.
The short answer to that is I learned how to do it one way, and I haven't actually used the fracture strands per cluster to tune fracture geometry, because I prefer to have more control using PDP, permeability, etc., which is basically what the fracture strands per cluster does, and it gives an explanation of it right here.
Yeah. So a few months back, we added this fracture strands per swarm, which is this idea that when hydraulic fractures are propagating, it's more than one dominant fracture, or it's more than one fracture, but instead you have a dominant fracture and then multiple subparallel fractures. And that's a phenomenon that's been observed in many cross studies. And so then Fu et al., which I think were from Lawrence Livermore, published a paper this last year where they looked at correlations of how to model these swarms as single fractures. And so, as Dave was saying, one way to account for this effect that's been observed in the field of multiple fracture strands is to use the fracture strand per swarm. And what that does is it adjusts PDP, so pressure-dependent permeability, which we're using to accelerate leak-off, then the maximum aperture, and the toughness. So in changing this parameter, you change those three separate parameters concurrently altogether. Alternatively, as Dave is doing, is you can tune each of those parameters individually. And so instead of using the correlations in Fu et al., you can effectively create your own correlation by modifying each of those independently. And so one of those is the effective fracture aperture conductivity factor, where you can reduce that to values less than 1. And recently we've been moving more towards like 0.1 to 0.2 on this. And what that does is it makes the maximum aperture of the fracture, or the effective aperture, smaller to account that there's fluid leaking off into these multiple subparallel fractures. And as a consequence, the viscous pressure drop down that fracture is greater. And when you have greater pressure drop, that then incentivizes more symmetry in the fracture, because pressure is building on one wing of the fracture, it'll incentivize it to grow the opposite direction. The second parameter would be the relative fracture toughness. And this is one that we've used for a very long time to tune the total length and height of fractures. And so the more subparallel strands that you have, the higher the assumed fracture toughness would be. Or you can tune it independently, right? So you could bring that to 0.1. You could use that as something like 1.5, which is already pretty high. And then the third parameter would be under curve sets, where we define a pressure-dependent permeability multiplier above a delta P of some threshold. And so, in this case, when the pressure in a fracture exceeds 890 psi above the original, or I'm sorry, I misspoke. When a matrix element sees a pressure that is 893 psi higher than its original pressure, the permeability is multiplied by 10. And so, no, we don't actually think permeability in the rock is increasing by a factor of 50, but in the Leakoff equation, fracture area and permeability are interchangeable. And so since we are only modeling one fracture, but we believe that there are multiple fractures, we can account for that by increasing permeability. And then when pressure drops back down, namely when you start producing the well, then you return back to that original permeability value.
Cool, thanks guys. Yeah, that's a neat little knob to tune geometry there. Appreciate it. And I love the paper references in the descriptions. It's a great feature. Thanks again.
Yep, awesome. Okay, well, as I said, this is the start of just some framework around recommended practices for interpreting simulations and comparing them. And I'll continue to work on this over the next couple of weeks to provide a more prescriptive recipe for comparing simulations and make that something very methodical. So thanks for tuning in today. And let us know if you have any questions or any topics you'd like covered in future office hours. And we will be sure to cover those. Or if you just want to talk Will Ferrell movies, we can do that as well.